Hello Spark fans and welcome back to Advancing Spark. We have a news day for you today because Databricks have released Databricks Runtime 7.4. It's still in beta, so it's not in full production grade or any of that kind of stuff, but we can have a play with the new features and start to get an angle on what can we use them for, what does it mean to us, do we need to change any of our working practices, and are there anything that we've been waiting for that has finally been released. So we're going to be looking at things like constraints on a table, hallelujah. We'll be looking at things like multiple outputs in Python, which is crazy useful. The ability to roll back a delta table. A few different like quality of life kind of things. And there's a few other bits and pieces in the release notes which we'll step into. So don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. And let us know in the comments if there's anything you see as super useful that we've missed, or generally what you're looking forward to next. So let's crack on. Okay, so as usual, we have this runtime overview page, got the release notes. So a few bits and pieces that we have in here. So a load of Delta Lake improvements. So we've got things like constraints, which we'll have a look at in a second. We've got a rollback. Now, you technically could roll back before, but it was really dodgy. It was very dodgy and not at all supported, but you kind of could. And we've got some stuff to do with streaming. So we'll have a look at what they mean. So let's dig into constraints first. So if you're coming from a SQL background, if you're used to relational database systems, constraints are old hat. They're things that we all know about that have been a big missing part of the managed data model puzzle in Databricks for quite a while. So simply put, we can, when we're creating a table, in the table definition, we can say things like, you're not allowed to be null, or you have to be between this range. It has to be under 10,000 for an int, whatever it happens to be. Now, this allows us to have a level of rigor in terms of what's going into our tables. So if we're using something as the primary identifier and we're merging data into that table based on a certain key, we want that key to be not null. It just makes sense. And previously, we've not been able to do that. So in a data frame specification, you can mention nullability in terms of what that schema looks like. But you couldn't do it in your table level. So actually, people could still just insert garbage into your table. So having constraints just allows us to put a few blockers saying you're not allowed to insert here unless you meet these constraints, which is great. So there's a few examples in there. I'll put it out. We can add some checks in there to go and actually sort of check it after the fact. So it's not just saying any new rows have to meet it. It's any new rows and make sure existing rows also meet this constraint when we add it in. So fairly standard stuff from a relational management point of view, but it's another step in terms of the Lake ecosystem getting closer to being a real professional database management system, right? It's another step on that lake house journey, saying lakes are getting the maturity and discipline and rigor that we expect with something where we've got a managed data model, and things like constraints are a big part of that. So awesome. That's number one feature. Okay, number two. So rolling back. So we've now got this restore function. So we can now say, so I've got my various different histories coming from the transaction log in a Delta table. And I can say, actually, can you go back and make that the current history and just roll back any changes that have happened since? Now, those of us who have a fairly pragmatic approach to some of these things might have done that in the past by deleting transaction records. So you could kinda just about go into an existing Delta table, go into the transaction log and remove records. But it's not tidy, it's not clean, it doesn't really fit into everything, it leaves orphans files around. It is not a recommended thing to do. But apart from that, there's no way to do it. You have to essentially do a full select of your table with a time travel parameter, with that version as of, timestamp as of, bring it up, and then full overwrite that back over the table. So whichever method you used, it either had a load of risks and really wasn't supported, or it had a massive overhead and wasn't particularly performant. Now we've got this. So we've got a function that we can just run on a table to say, go back to that previous version. It'll log it in the audit table properly. We'll have that proper transaction log record. It'll be part of the Delta table's history. And that gives us a nice mechanism for working with it. Starting version. So we saw last release, so in 7.3, the ability, if we're streaming from a Delta table, we could tell it the version to start with. But we had to give it an actual version number. So if you wanted just to say, just take the latest version, you had to run a little query on the history of that table, bring back the version number, collect it up to the driver, and pass that in as the parameter. Fairly convoluted. Now we've got a little quick thing of saying, just get the latest. Whenever I run that, just get the latest version of that Delta table and bring it over. Nice, easy, makes sense. Fairly small change, but just saves that little awkward workaround that we used to have. Another one on the list is usage. So we've got this idea of, the table access control stuff. So saying, I don't want to have people always just using pass-through to my lake. I want people to actually be able to only see the Hive databases and tables that they have privileges to. And I want to have that SQL access layer and control everything by granting, grant select on, grant whatever. And usage is a new thing that's come in from 7.4. So if we strip over to that, the main thing, I think it's easy to see this. So in table access control, when we're talking about granting privileges to a user, we can do these different things. So select, makes sense. Create, okay, you can't create tables and views unless you've got that. Modify, makes sense. Usage. Usage is the ability to use a particular object. Now, before 7.4, that wasn't mandatory. So if you had select on it, you could just go ahead and anything you have select privileges on, you can go ahead and work with. Usage comes in from 7.4 and is enforced. Meaning, even if you have select privileges, if you don't have usage privilege, then you can't use it. A little bit weird. It's like something like an overall privilege to be able to interact with those objects using the privileges that you've got. So I believe the main kind of thing that this is coming into is allowing people to use things without them being able to share and extend privileges and pass it on to other people. So it's another layer of more security. And it's actually maturity of the security model that we're using here. So some good stuff. Again, inside a database object, if you want to use anything inside there, you need the usage permission. So if you're using table access control all over the place and you upgrade to 7.4 and you don't add that in, people are suddenly not going to have access. So be a little bit careful about how you're working with these things. Don't forget you can do this at the group level. So you can have a group of Databricks users and say this group has usage on this Hive table, usage on this Hive table, and then select and modify and whatever else they need. So that is new. And as again, more maturity, more growth in the table access control side of things. Remember, you have to have that turned on at the workspace level, and then on each cluster that you want to use table access control, turn it on for that cluster. So a few different things in there to tie together. Finally, DBS Fuse is enabled for pass-through clusters. So DBS Fuse, it's a bit of a weird one. And actually reading through this, I think I need to dig into this a bit more. So DBS Fuse was originally for using local file storage APIs on a cluster. So if you're doing a load of work in a cluster and you're like, I need to put this data down into disk and then pull it up and then down into disk and do lots of local storage type stuff, or especially if you're doing things that actually isn't using Spark, and you're using something that's distributed across your clusters, and they don't want to be going off reading various passive queries, JDBC queries, data reads, anything using the data reader object, they're not using because it's all going in local Python. Then you could use this DBS Fuse to have real high performance storage mounted to those clusters. And that previously wasn't available in high concurrency passive enabled clusters. You couldn't use it. That's enabled it. However, I'm curious because regular mounts are supported. So now I want to dig in and just say, actually, when we're using mounts, is there an element that we can now use DBS Fuse in those passive clusters, even for mounted storage, not just the local file APIs? So I want to have a dig into that. At first glance, I was like, doesn't really mean much for how we work when we're dealing with big Spark jobs and we've got a lake. But actually, there might be more to that. So I'm going to do a bit of digging and then hopefully come back with some news over the next couple of weeks. Okay, other bits, Spark SQL now supports IIF and char index, so if you're used to using a different flavor of SQL, that's now supported. This one is huge for me. So, if you're in a notebook and you're writing various bits of Python and you do a display, and then you write a bit more code inside that same cell and then you do another display, it only displays the last one. So if you're saying, display this data frame, blah, 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 display this next data frame, you'll only get the last data frame. It's kind of annoying. It just means that sometimes you arbitrarily have to break your cells up more than is natural, just because you want to see each individual output. So now we can actually say view multiple outputs on the cell by default automatically, which is super useful. And I'll show you a little bit about that. We've improved autocomplete. Again, autocomplete is one of the things that's never been fantastic inside Databricks. So actually making this better and making it using the Gen library, meaning it's going to be a little bit more code context aware of what you're actually writing. Awesome. Very, very good to kind of just improve the developer experience, right? And then other bits and pieces, some ML improvements. There's 1 or 2 bits, some bug fixes, and there's the usual gigantic pile of here's all the bugs that we've gone in. So I recommend you go through that if there's any bugs you're waiting to be fixed. But let's have a quick look at some examples. So I've got a lake here. This is empty, nothing up my sleeves kind of thing. And let's have a look at that. We'll do the rollback first. So I'm going to go and quickly do a little quick example. Let's create a table, put some data in there, and then we'll do a quick merge into that table. That's creating a table, nothing special, just a real straightforward like address style table. It's an example I use loads. So inserting some data into it, so I've got a basic table, doing a little view to get some data ready, and then we're doing a merge. So essentially I've got my initial table I created, then I've got one version, which is the table with the merge into it. Let's just do a quick select from that table, and then we can go and have a look and see what that looks like. Okay, so you can see I've done a merge. I've got my new record in that merge. I've got my old record, which I've now timed out. So I've got one that's false, it's got an end date, I've got one that's true. Essentially, I have updated the table, right? I've also got a brand new record that was added. So what we're expecting is we've got a version of the table that looks like this. So 3 records, nothing's been closed from a slowly changing point of view. And I've got a version of the table that looks like this. So we've got 2 extra records and 1 update to an existing record. Okay. So we can go and we can do the history actually. We can go and say what's happened inside this table. And we should see our 2 versions. So we've got our initial create, we've got when we wrote data to it, and we've got when we did our merge. All makes sense. And this is the new command. So that restore my table to version as of, and then that is the version we want to restore. So in this case, I want to roll back the merge. I'm like, oh, didn't do that merge properly. I did it on the wrong key. I did something wrong. So we want to get rid of this version. So essentially, we want to roll back to version 1. So in this case, we can do this, restore data AI addresses to version as of 1. And again, that could be a timestamp or a version. It's kind of up to us. So I'm running that. Runs a transaction, does a load of stuff. And if we go off and we do this again, let's just do select from our table. You should hopefully see, there we go. So it's now automatically back at that version 1. Now, it's not really at version 1. Because if we look at the history, that rollback comes in as a version all of its own. So we've now got a version 3, which was created as a restore, and we get a load of information about what actually happened inside that restore. So we can see the operation metrics, how many files were restored, how many files were removed, all the stuff that actually happened. So it's not quite made to version 1, but it's reinstated version 1 as a new version at the top, which is now the current version of that Delta table. Pretty cool, really useful. Tons and tons of just operational use cases for working with that. And especially dealing with that with also clone. So you make a clone something, try out some changes, undo it, try out some changes, make another clone, and then wipe everything back. There's just so many more usability things we can do with this kind of functionality coming in. So rollback or restore, super, super, super useful. Okay, constraints. Let's have another look at this stuff. So again, same example actually. I'm just taking that same table created, so I called it constraints this time, but it's the same structure. Into a new thing, I'm passing in some data, and I've nulled a primary key. So one of the bits of data coming in has a null where I'd normally have the primary key there. And that should let me do it. Doesn't care. It's fine. It's like, yeah, sure. It doesn't know that because I called it primary key, it doesn't know it's actually, I'm going to use it as a primary key. So it lets me do that kind of thing by default. Now, if I want to come in here, we can say not null, just as a constraint inside our table. So it's part of our table definition. And then that means when I'm trying to do that insert, I now get an exception saying, no, it's not null. You can't insert that data. So it's protecting my table from inserting bad data. And then I can handle that error. I can do something with it. I can pass it back. You tell someone off and say, can you please give me good data into my table, please? So awesome. Super, super useful. Just straightforward, right? But it's the kind of thing that's been missing inside lake systems for a long, long time. So again, super useful. And then the final little, like my little multiple outputs thing, it's just so useful when you want to programmatically do displays. So in this case, I'm saying I want to do show tables from AdventureWorks, right? I've got a database called AdventureWorks. I'm running the show tables Hive command to say, just tell me everything that's currently inside that Hive database. While it's running, I can just show you I've got my tables over here. So inside AdventureWorks, I just want to get this list back, right? So that's going to give me a little data frame. And not a lot of people know that you can actually just use that as a data frame command. So I'm going to make a data frame, which is the results of that Hive query. And then what I can do is I can collect that Hive query up, do a for each, do a for a table in my data frame collect statement, and then I can write a little thing on top of it. Okay, so there we go. So I've got my data frame back. Don't know why that took so long, but still. So we can say what's inside that data frame. Okay, so it's a real quick list of AdventureWorks country. False, fine. I'm doing a for each. So I'm saying for each table, so for each row that's going to be in that data frame, once I've collected it back up to the driver, and then I'm just building out a select statement. So select the table name as my table name, do a count star from the database, from things, and that's going to run a display command for each table. Now, previously, I couldn't do that. I mean, that just wouldn't work if I didn't have multiple outputs enabled. I would have to do something like just build a blank data frame and then have a merge, have a kind of a union command saying, get these results, union in, get these results, union in, and then only once it's finished doing everything, I could do a display. But that's just extra programming, right? That's just extra work you have to do. If you really, really quickly just want to say, just show me some results of a thing, there we go. I can now just super quickly just print out multiple results programmatically using things like for each loops, all that kind of stuff. So it's a tiny thing, but just actually enables some different working practices, which is so, so useful. The example they've got in the docs is, if you want to see, actually, here's my data table, and then here's like the output of an image from like some Seaborn or Matplotlib or something. So if I'm doing a display over some charting, I can do that and get my data out without having to have multiple cells and break things up. Super small little thing, super, super, super useful. Okay, so they are all the changes I wanted to go through. So 7.4 is out in beta currently. I'll drop that link to that runtime description, the release notes down below. Again, let us know if there's anything in there that you think you've missed. Let us know what you see in there, and when you go, oh, we can use it for, we want to know, just get in touch, drop something in the comments, let us know what you think. All right, otherwise, we'll be back next week with more words, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.